The morning of April 19th, 1865, rose slowly over the wounded land around Fort Steedman, as if even the sun feared what it might see. Only a few days had passed since the war had ended, yet nothing felt peaceful. Smoke still curled from burned wagons. Trees still leaned, broken from cannon fire. The ground still bore the weight of death. In the middle of this broken place stood a small, collapsing farmhouse. Its wooden beams sagged, its windows were cracked like shattered ice. The porch tilted to one side, as if trying to slip away from the terrible memories it held. Inside that house, sitting against the far wall, was Eleanor Hale. Her dress had once been neat and pretty. Now it clung to her skin in torn, dirty pieces, stiff with dried sweat, mud, and stains she wished she could forget. Her hair hung in tangled strands over her face. Her feet were bare and bruised. Her hands, folded tightly on her lap, trembled with every distant noise. But the worst mark on her was not the bruises, not the dirt, not the ripped fabric. It was the ink burned into the cloth against her thigh. Property of Company B, 2nd Division, Army of the Tennessee. The words felt like chains she could not remove. For a long time she stared at the floorboards. Some were cracked, some were stained. A few held dark splatters she refused to examine. She breathed slowly, each breath heavy in her chest. Every few moments she wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, though she knew no tears were falling. She was far past tears. Her body had gone too numb for that. Outside, she heard the slow, steady scrape of metal on dirt. Union soldiers worked in silence, lifting bodies, laying them in rows, covering them with blankets. It was the kind of work men did when there was no other choice, when death was no longer shocking, when grief had become part of everyday life. A wagon creaked under the weight of the dead. A horse snorted in the cold air. Boots thudded softly as soldiers moved from one body to the next. No shouting, no anger, only duty. Eleanor's fingers curled tighter. Each sound reminded her of the night before, of hands grabbing her, voices shouting orders, laughter that felt like knives, and the cold, unshakable terror that had carved itself into her bones. She squeezed her eyes shut. Do not remember. Do not think. Just breathe. But breathing was hard. A gust of wind blew through a broken wall plank, lifting a few strands of her hair. Dust motes floated in the sunlight like tiny ghosts. Then, far away, so faint she thought she imagined it, came a voice. "Eleanor!" Her heart stopped. She lifted her head. Again, louder this time, raw, desperate. "Eleanor!" Her husband, Thomas Hale, a Confederate officer, a man who had written her letters full of hope and dreams, was running toward the farmhouse. His gray uniform was torn, his boots muddy, his face strained with panic. Two other Confederate officers rushed behind him, shouting warnings, trying to keep up. Union soldiers stepped forward to block their path, not with rifles, just with tired arms and weary eyes. "You can't cross this line, sir. This area is under our command." Thomas didn't listen. "That is my wife," he shouted, trying to push through. "Let me through! Let me see her!" His voice cracked on the last word. Pain slipped into every syllable. The Union soldiers didn't raise their weapons. No one wanted more blood. The war had taken enough already. But rules were rules, and they held him back gently but firmly. Thomas struggled until he nearly collapsed. He leaned forward, gasping, his breath shaking as if the world itself was crushing his chest. Inside the farmhouse, Eleanor pressed a shaking hand to her mouth. She wanted to answer him. She wanted to run to him, throw her arms around him, hide her face in his shoulder. But something inside her, something broken, would not move. Her body felt heavy, like it belonged to someone else. A shadow filled the doorway. A young Union private entered, slow and careful, as if he feared a loud step might shatter her. He held his cap in his hands, his eyes stayed on the floor. "Ma'am," he said softly, "your husband, he's outside, he's begging to see you." His voice carried no threat, only sorrow. Eleanor didn't speak. The private shifted awkwardly. "Ma'am, we're moving people to a safer place. If you can walk, we'll escort you. If not, we can help carry you." Eleanor's entire body flinched. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No touching." The private nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am. Understood." He stepped back toward the doorway, but waited, giving her time. His face showed no judgment, only the tired sadness of a man who had seen too much suffering for his young age. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "your husband is waiting. Would you like to see him?" Her throat tightened painfully. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She felt a mix of shame, fear, love, and confusion twist inside her until she almost couldn't breathe. At last, she forced out a whisper. "Tell him I need a moment." The private nodded. "Yes, ma'am." He stepped outside. As soon as Thomas saw him exit alone, he tried to rush forward again. "Let me in! Let me see her! Please, she needs me!" The soldiers held him back, their voices gentle, their grips steady. "Sir, she'll come out when she's ready. Let her have a little time." Thomas's knees buckled. He sank halfway to the ground, hands in his hair, breath shaking as if the world itself was crushing his chest. Inside the farmhouse, Eleanor closed her eyes and leaned her head against the wooden wall. It felt cool, solid, real. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "It's over. The war is over." But a hollow ache spread through her chest, because she knew the truth. For some, the war ends when the guns go silent. For others, the war continues inside them long after the fighting stops. And for Eleanor Hale, standing in the ruins of the farmhouse, the real battle had only just begun.
For a long moment after the Union private left, the small farmhouse felt too quiet, the kind of silence that presses on the skin and fills the lungs. Eleanor stayed against the wall, staring at the broken doorway, her heart beating painfully in her chest. She could hear Thomas outside, arguing with the soldiers trying to hold him back. "She can't be alone in there," he cried. "She's hurt. She needs me." Every shout made Eleanor flinch. She pulled her knees closer and wrapped her arms around them. Her dress, stiff with dirt and dried sweat, scratched against her skin. She tried to breathe slowly, but each breath felt too sharp, like her ribs were made of glass. "I should go to him," she thought. "He deserves that. He came for me." But her legs would not obey. Her hands shook too badly. The memory of strangers' hands grabbing her, pinning her down, branding her with ink still crawled over her skin like insects. She pressed her forehead to her knees and whispered, "Please, give me strength." Outside, the morning sun climbed higher. Boots crunched in the grass. A wagon rolled closer, wheels bumping over uneven earth. Union soldiers continued their grim work, lifting bodies, checking uniforms, writing names in a small ledger so families might one day know where their loved ones lay. A quiet, steady rhythm of a world trying to rebuild itself. When the private returned to stand by the doorway, he didn't step inside. He simply lowered his voice and said, "Ma'am, I told him. He's waiting for you. We can keep the other men back if you want. No one will touch you." She swallowed hard. Is he angry? No, ma'am, the private said gently. He's scared, that's all. Scared. Thomas Hale, proud Confederate officer, strong as the Carolina pines, scared. Eleanor took one long, shaking breath and pushed her back away from the wall. Her legs wobbled, pain shot through her hip. She steadied herself on a broken chair and stood fully for the first time since dawn. The farmhouse swayed around her, or maybe it was her own body. Her vision blurred for a moment. She blinked until the room returned to focus. I can walk, she whispered to herself. I must walk. She took one step, then another. The floor creaked under her bare feet. Every step felt like stepping through a memory she did not want to remember. At the doorway, the private stepped back respectfully. Take your time, ma'am. Eleanor nodded, though she couldn't find her voice to answer. She clutched the torn edges of her dress and stepped into the sunlight. The brightness hit her at once. Her eyes squeezed shut. Warmth spread across her skin, but it felt strange, almost painful after the cold dark of the farmhouse. When she opened her eyes again, everything looked different. The field stretched wide around her. Soldiers moved like shadows across the grass. Smoke drifted in thin white threads toward the sky. A large tent stood near the edge of the woods, temporary shelter for wounded men, marked with a faded symbol of the Union Army. And there, only a few yards away, held back gently by Union hands, stood Thomas. His face changed the instant he saw her. For a heartbeat, he looked as if the ground had disappeared under him. His eyes widened, his lips parted, but no sound came out. His hands, tense and ready to fight moments ago, dropped helplessly to his sides. The sergeant holding his arm stepped back and let go. Thomas didn't run to her. He didn't rush forward in some dramatic sweeping motion. Instead, he moved slowly, softly, like a man approaching something sacred and fragile. Eleanor, he breathed. Her legs trembled. She tried to speak his name, but her voice broke like a weak thread. Thomas stopped a few feet from her, as if afraid that stepping closer might frighten her. For a moment, the whole field fell quiet. Even the soldiers paused in their work, watching with tired but gentle eyes. They understood what this moment was. They had seen reunions before, some filled with joy, others with heartbreak. Thomas lifted his hand halfway, then lowered it again, unsure. Eleanor, please tell me you're all right. She wanted to nod, to lie, to save him from pain, but she couldn't. Her lips trembled. I'm alive. A tear rolled down Thomas's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He stepped a little closer. Did they hurt you? Eleanor's breath caught. Her body stiffened. Her arms wrapped instinctively around her middle. Every muscle in her face tensed. Thomas saw the reaction and immediately stopped moving. I'm sorry, he whispered. I shouldn't have asked. His hands lifted again, this time palms open, showing he meant no harm. I won't touch you unless you ask me to. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she had thought were gone forever. That simple promise, soft, careful, patient, felt like the first breath of air after drowning. The world around them returned slowly. A breeze lifted the edge of her ruined dress. A bird cried somewhere in the trees. A wagon creaked as soldiers loaded it with another covered body. Eleanor looked at Thomas fully for the first time. His uniform was torn at the shoulder. Dried mud covered his boots. His face was thinner than she remembered. His eyes held exhaustion and something deeper, something wounded. The war had not been kind to him either. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner," Thomas whispered, voice shaking. "If I had known, if the surrender had come a day earlier, I would have reached you. I swear it." Eleanor shook her head weakly. "You couldn't have stopped them." Thomas swallowed heavily. He looked at the ground, fists tightening. "I would have tried," he whispered. The private who had helped Eleanor stood nearby, watching quietly. Then he approached Thomas with care. "Sir, we can give you both a tent if she needs to rest. The officers won't disturb you. No one here means her harm. The war's done. We're just tired." Thomas nodded gratefully. "Thank you." Eleanor felt her strength slipping. The sunlight, though warm, made her dizzy. Her knees weakened beneath her. When she swayed slightly, Thomas moved forward on instinct, but stopped himself an inch away, waiting for her permission. She met his eyes. "It's all right," she whispered. "You can help me." Thomas breathed out shakily, relief flooding his face. He slipped an arm gently, carefully, around her shoulders, his touch as soft as he could make it. Eleanor leaned into him, her weight pressing against his chest. His warmth surrounded her, steady and familiar. For the first time since the night before, she felt the faintest hint of safety. Not much, not enough, but something. The private led them toward the tent near the tree line. Soldiers stepped aside respectfully as they passed. Some looked away, giving them privacy. Others nodded quietly, understanding too well the kind of wounds no doctor could see. Thomas held her, guiding her slowly over the uneven ground. "Just a little farther," he whispered. "I've got you, Eleanor. You're safe now. I promise." She closed her eyes. Safe. That word felt foreign. But as she leaned against him, feeling his steady breath, she allowed herself, just for this moment, to believe it might one day be true.
The first night after Eleanor's release from Fort Steedman passed like a shadow that refused to end. She could not sleep, not fully, not anywhere near the way sleep should have been. Even in Thomas's presence, even with the warmth of his arms around her, the memories clawed at her mind, relentless. Every creak of the tent, every distant shout, every rustle of leaves outside the canvas wall set her nerves ablaze. Was it a Union soldier? Or worse, a memory of the men who had touched her when she had no voice, no choice? She flinched at every sound. Thomas had tried to soothe her. His voice was low, steady. "It's all right. No one can touch you here." He repeated it over and over, though Eleanor suspected he too felt powerless against the memory of what had occurred. She did not answer. Words were weak. Words could not erase the shame, the fear, the anger, the despair. By the time the sun rose, Eleanor felt hollow, as though the night had taken pieces of her body and soul and left only shadows in their place. She could not stay. She could not linger in this fragile bubble of temporary safety. She needed distance. She needed motion. She needed to find herself somewhere beyond the war, beyond the tents, beyond the soldiers who reminded her constantly of the world she had lost. Thomas tried to protest, but Eleanor shook her head firmly. "I have to go," she said. Her voice, though small, carried the weight of finality. "I cannot stay here. I need to move." He looked at her with pain flickering in his eyes. "Eleanor, what about me? We can leave together. We can—" "No," she interrupted softly, yet firmly. "I cannot bring you back into danger. Not again. Her hands trembled, gripping the edge of her tattered dress. I will find a road. I will find someone who can help. And maybe, one day, I will find you again. Thomas pressed his lips together. He wanted to argue. He wanted to insist. But he understood, deep down, that this was not a decision she could be persuaded from. The war had taken too much. Her will had hardened in ways only trauma could forge. To try to hold her back would be to risk shattering her entirely. The small town where the Union headquarters had provided temporary shelter felt alien. The streets were filled with people moving with purpose, but purpose had nothing to do with her. She walked along the rough dirt paths, dragging her feet. Each step felt heavy, weighted with loss, fear, and the faint flickering hope that she might one day be free. Along the way, she encountered other travelers, families with children clinging to carts, former slaves navigating uncertain roads, deserters moving like shadows through chaos. None spoke to her directly. None looked at her twice. Everyone had their own burdens, their own fears, their own grief. In this fractured world, she was invisible and visible all at once. By the second day, Eleanor had joined two other women who had fled Fort Steedman with her, the doctor's wife from Tennessee and one of the merchant's daughters from Alabama. They were silent most of the time, each consumed by private fear. They walked together in the mornings and evenings, resting in the shade of trees during the blazing afternoon, drinking from streams and eating whatever berries and roots they could identify as safe. Their conversation was sparse, broken by long pauses filled with the sounds of nature or imagination. "I can't tell if that's a bird or a gunshot," the Tennessee woman whispered one dawn, crouching behind a fallen log. "Don't listen. It will make your mind play tricks," the Alabama girl replied. Eleanor said nothing. She simply nodded. She understood all too well the difference between reality and imagined threat, though neither provided comfort. Every step forward was a choice between fear and necessity. On the third day, they finally saw the glint of metal in the distance, a small Union patrol, 10 cavalrymen moving cautiously along the road. Eleanor froze instinctively. Her heart hammered so violently she feared it might burst. Her companions did the same. But the patrol did not rush toward them. It slowed. The lieutenant in charge dismounted, approaching slowly, holding his hands open as if to show peace. Eleanor recognized a small hope forming in the pit of her stomach. She stepped forward, speaking first. We are women from Fort Steedman. We were detained and escaped." The lieutenant's expression shifted from suspicion to careful interest, and finally, horror as they recounted the events. Eleanor spoke quietly, measured, yet with the weight of truth pressing on each word. She told him the confiscation, the march to Columbia, the attack by irregulars, the unauthorized release, and the terror of surviving the forest at night. Every word seemed to carry the weight of mountains. He listened, he wrote, he promised assistance. For the first time in days, Eleanor allowed herself to feel relief, a tiny ember in a landscape of ash. The patrol took them to the nearest Union headquarters. Eleanor was met by a captain who recorded her statement. The handwriting was almost unreadable to her, the language formal, dense. She was told her testimony would be referred to proper authorities, that temporary accommodations would be arranged, and that she must wait, as bureaucracy moves slowly, painfully. The temporary shelter was another tent, smaller and less organized than the previous, but still filled with the same symbols of control, soldiers in authority, rules to follow, eyes watching. Eleanor's heart sank. Escape from Fort Steedman was immediate, raw and terrifying. But even here she realized she had not left the system. She had simply moved into a different cage. The following day, an officer from the Judge Advocate General's Corps, uniformed, formal, sharp, interviewed her for hours. He asked precise, legal questions about every event, every officer, every word. Eleanor answered honestly. She told him what happened, knowing full well that her statements could be used in ways she could not predict. At the end of the interview, he spoke carefully. Ward's unauthorized release of detainees was being investigated. The irregular attack and its aftermath were under review. Complaints were being filed. Eleanor listened, her mind swirling with exhaustion, hope, and fear. Then came the offer. She could be released if she signed an agreement to remain silent and forego any legal action. Small financial compensation would be provided. Refusal meant indefinite detention. Eleanor understood the terms. She understood the extortion disguised as assistance. And yet, she could not fight. She could not summon the energy to battle systems that had already proven they could destroy her life in moments. She asked for a day to consider, spending the night staring at the canvas above her, listening to the wind, trying to grasp the scale of what had happened. By morning, she signed, not because she believed it was right, not because she trusted the army or the law, but because survival, even the fragile kind, required compromise. She left the tent with $12 in Union currency and a pass allowing her travel through Union-controlled territory. She had no information about Thomas's whereabouts, only hope. Hope that he survived, that he waited, that one day she could see him again. The road south stretched before her. The houses she passed were damaged, abandoned, stripped bare by war, by necessity, by the desperate. At night, she slept in barns, under trees, anywhere that offered some cover. She begged or scavenged for food. Twice, deserters stole what little she possessed. Twice, she felt the sharp teeth of fear and helplessness as the world reminded her she had nothing and no one to protect her. And yet, through all this, Eleanor moved, one step, then another, each footfall an act of defiance against the world that had tried to erase her, against the army, against the violence, against the night that had swallowed her companions. She was alive. She would find her way, even if that way led only to ashes, even if her home no longer existed, even if Thomas was nowhere to be found. She walked. The road south seemed endless. Each day blurred into the next, a tapestry of dust, sun, and fear. Eleanor had walked for hours with no certainty of what lay ahead, only the faint hope that reaching Charleston might mean safety, or at least something resembling it. The world she had known, the life she had known, had been stripped away. Each step carried her further from Fort Steedman, from Thomas, from the life she once believed she could reclaim. But it also carried her closer to survival, to agency, to the possibility of breathing without fear of being claimed as property. The countryside was scarred. Farms were burned. Houses were abandoned, their walls blackened by fire, their windows shattered. Fields that once fed families were trampled or left fallow. The air smelled faintly of smoke and decay. Birds chirped in the trees, but their songs were strange and hollow, like nature itself mourned the end of the war. Eleanor walked with her eyes wide, scanning the horizon for danger. She passed carts carrying refugees, people moving with a mixture of hope and terror, and she kept her distance. She wanted to avoid attention, to disappear into the crowd, to become another shadow among many. Food was scarce. Eleanor had learned to recognize safe berries and edible roots, though each meal was accompanied by a small, gnawing fear that it might be poisoned. Streams provided water, but even then she paused to inspect the flow, to imagine what dangers might lie hidden beneath the surface. Hunger was a constant companion, gnawing at her stomach and her nerves, reminding her that survival demanded vigilance, not just courage. By the 5th day, Eleanor's body ached. Blisters formed on her feet, and her legs felt like lead. Her dress was torn, stained, and stiff from dirt and sweat. Hair fell into her face, and she pushed it aside mechanically. Sleep came only in brief, fitful moments, hidden in the shade of trees or in the corner of abandoned barns. But each time she woke, the fear of discovery returned with full force. The world was filled with men, soldiers, deserters, opportunists who could take what little she had left, or worse. It was on the 7th day that she encountered another group of travelers, families with carts, former slaves moving toward freedom, and a few men who seemed lost or broken by war. Eleanor kept her distance, walking a few steps behind, listening, watching. The families did not question the 3 women walking together. The chaos of the road had rendered social norms meaningless. People were concerned with survival, not propriety, and the sight of women walking alone did not provoke suspicion. Eleanor noted this quietly, realizing that in this fractured world, her vulnerability was both a danger and a shield. At night, the 3 women slept in the open when necessary, using cloaks or blankets salvaged from abandoned homes. Fear made sleep light and fleeting. Each rustle in the dark brought a surge of adrenaline. Every shadow could be a threat, and Eleanor learned to lie perfectly still, breathing shallowly, listening to the night, letting hours pass in silence. Her companions did the same, and the unspoken understanding between them became a fragile bond stronger than words could convey. They were not friends in the old sense, not yet, but they were allies against a world that had tried to strip them of their humanity. On the 9th day, Eleanor's group encountered another Union patrol. Relief surged through her chest, but it was tempered by wariness. She had learned that not all soldiers were kind, not all were protectors. She stepped forward carefully, voice low but steady. "We are refugees, from Fort Steedman, from Columbia. We need help." The lieutenant who approached listened as Eleanor recounted her journey. She described the march, the forest, the fear, the hunger, the night they had spent running from invisible enemies. She told him about the women who had been lost, the suffering they had endured, the terror that lingered like a shadow in every moment. The officer nodded, his expression grave, and promised to escort them to the nearest headquarters where they could rest and receive food. For the first time, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine a small measure of safety. The Union patrol led them to a small town, battered and exhausted. Streets were pocked with artillery craters. Homes were damaged, many abandoned. Shops were empty, their shelves bare. The town had survived the war, but it had been transformed into a place of survival rather than living. Eleanor felt both relief and apprehension as she walked among the ruins. Relief that the immediate danger of the road had passed. Apprehension because the world she was entering offered no guarantees, only new rules and new expectations she could not yet know. At the headquarters, Eleanor and her companions were given a brief meal and allowed to rest. The food was simple, but it filled the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. She felt the tension in her body ease, if only slightly, as she finally closed her eyes in a bed that was not the hard earth or a pile of hay. Sleep came, deep and dreamless, like a temporary reprieve from the endless motion of the road. On the 10th day, Eleanor awoke to a quiet town, sun cutting through the clouds in golden streams. She dressed as best she could, washed in a basin of cool water, and gathered her few belongings. The patrol officer, a kind man who had listened to her story with patience, handed her a note of safe passage. He said, "Keep this. It will allow you to move through Union areas without interference. Stick to the roads, avoid abandoned farms unless necessary, and keep moving south. You'll find Charleston if you follow the main route." Eleanor thanked him silently, tucking the paper into her dress. Each letter was a fragile lifeline in a world of uncertainty. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope that she might reach her destination alive. As she left the town, Eleanor noticed the resilience of others on the road. Families pushed carts through mud and rubble, children clinging to parents who themselves appeared broken yet determined. Former slaves walked with purpose, faces set toward freedom, even as their bodies bore the marks of years of oppression. Eleanor observed quietly, drawing strength from their persistence, realizing that she too could survive, that she too could endure, that the world had not yet claimed her entirely. On the 10th day, rain brought, soft at first, then heavier, soaking clothes and hair, washing dust into mud, chilling bones that had grown numb from constant motion. Eleanor found shelter under the roof of an abandoned barn, sharing it with her companions. They huddled together for warmth, shivering silently, grateful for the meager protection from the storm. The sound of rain on tin roof was soothing, yet it reminded her of the uncertainty that awaited once they ventured back into the open road. Still, she felt a small sense of continuity in the rain, a reminder that the world persisted even when human cruelty had left devastation in its wake. On the 11th day, Eleanor's exhaustion pressed heavily upon her. Her feet were raw, her muscles a constant ache, and yet she continued. Charleston was near, she told herself, not safe, not restored, but a destination, a place where her sister might still live, a place where perhaps she could exist again in some form, even if the life she had known would never return. Finally, on the 12th day, the spires of Charleston emerged on the horizon. Smoke rose from scattered ruins. Streets seemed empty and silent, like a city holding its breath after years of violence. Eleanor's heart thumped violently as she approached. She had survived the war, the confiscation, the forest, the road, and the uncertainty of the world. She had survived the terror of the unknown. But survival was only the first step. What awaited her in Charleston was not certainty, but the fragile possibility of rebuilding something, anything, beyond fear. She paused at the outskirts, taking in the city. The streets were devastated, buildings reduced to shells, yet life persisted. She could see people moving among the ruins, repairing, scavenging, living. A small ember of hope ignited in her chest. Perhaps she could find her sister. Perhaps she could find some semblance of home. Perhaps she could live again, even if only in fragments. With a deep breath, she stepped forward, leaving the road behind her and entering Charleston, the city that would mark the next chapter of her life, a city scarred by war, yet still alive, like her. Charleston was a city of ghosts and half-lives. The buildings stood like hollowed teeth in the sunlight, crumbling brick and splintered wood jutting into the sky. Smoke rose in thin streams from the few homes that still functioned as residences. The streets were quiet, but not empty. There were people moving with urgent, careful steps, scanning for danger or opportunity, their faces lined with exhaustion, grief, and hope all at once. Eleanor's heart thumped as she navigated the ruined city, each step a negotiation between fear and necessity. She had an address, one she clutched in her hand as if it were a talisman, her sister Catherine's home. The paper was smudged, corners frayed from the journey, yet it was a lifeline. Eleanor walked slowly, cautious of the uneven streets, wary of strangers, aware of the curious eyes that followed a lone woman navigating the city alone. Each glance reminded her that vulnerability could be exploited, that in a city struggling to survive, trust was rare and caution essential. When she finally arrived at Catherine's home, Eleanor hesitated. The house had survived better than most, though the paint was chipped and the garden was overgrown. She knocked lightly on the door, uncertain if anyone would answer, if her sister would even recognize her. The minutes stretched. Each creak of the floorboards inside made her chest tighten. Then the door opened. Catherine stood there, and for a moment neither spoke. Her eyes widened as they took in Eleanor's figure, the torn dress, the dust on her skin, the exhaustion etched into her face. Recognition sparked, and then relief, and then grief all at once. Eleanor's arms wrapped around Catherine, and they clung to each other, the embrace both a reunion and a release. Tears fell freely, unspoken grief for what had been endured, for what had been lost, for the impossibility of putting the past behind them entirely. Catherine's husband appeared next, a man whose eyes had seen too much of war's aftermath. He took in Eleanor with caution, concern, and curiosity, as though trying to read whether the woman before him was the sister he remembered or someone broken beyond repair. Catherine explained briefly, her voice trembling, how Eleanor had come through the chaos, how she had survived, and how she needed shelter, food, and care. Her husband nodded, silent but acquiescent, understanding the urgency without words. Inside, Eleanor was given a small room. A bed, modest and creaky, awaited her. The walls were bare but solid, the room warm from the late spring sun. Catherine found clothes that fit better than Eleanor's tattered dress, simple garments that restored some dignity without pretension. Food was prepared carefully: bread, broth, a few preserved vegetables. Eleanor's stomach, unused to consistent meals, rebelled, but she ate slowly, savoring nourishment that felt almost like safety. Even in this small sanctuary, Eleanor felt the weight of the world she carried. Each bite of food, each touch of cloth, each moment of quiet reminded her that survival was not yet living. Memories of Fort Steedman, of confiscation, of the forest, of hunger and fear haunted her. Sleep came, but the dreams were filled with shadows, whispers of soldiers' voices, footsteps in the dark, the faces of women who had not made it. She woke drenched in sweat, shaking, heart racing, and Catherine was there, waiting silently with water and quiet reassurance. Over the following days, Eleanor began to speak in fragments, recounting parts of her journey she could bear to describe. She told Catherine about the forest, the nights spent listening to imagined and real dangers, the women who had shared the march south, the encounters with Union patrols, and the tenuous arrival in Charleston. She omitted the most horrifying details, the ones that had seared themselves into memory, for even saying them aloud seemed impossible. Catherine listened, absorbing what she could, mourning for what she could not comprehend fully. Eleanor urged Catherine to report the abuses she had witnessed. She spoke of filing complaints, seeking justice, holding those responsible accountable. Eleanor shook her head. The documents she had signed during her brief time in Union custody loomed over her like a prison. Any hope of justice through official channels had been effectively nullified. She explained to Catherine that speaking publicly might mark her as troublesome, potentially subjecting her to renewed scrutiny or danger, that the system had already demonstrated it was indifferent to individual suffering. Yet Eleanor's presence was a quiet form of defiance. She had survived, she had carried her truth with her, and she refused to disappear entirely. In those first weeks in Charleston, her days settled into a fragile rhythm, helping with household chores, visiting her sister's children, walking cautiously through the city streets, and learning which parts of the city were safe, which held danger, and which offered opportunity. Each small act of normalcy was a reclamation of agency, a defiance of the world that had tried to render her invisible. Yet even in moments of routine, Eleanor knew the fragility of her position. Every interaction, every decision carried risk. The documents she had signed during her detainment lingered in her mind as chains that could not be removed. Every encounter with authorities reminded her that she was still a figure defined by bureaucratic decisions and wartime policies that had reduced her humanity. Yet she persisted, quietly, steadily, like a candle burning against wind and shadow. In Charleston, Eleanor Hale began to understand a difficult truth. Survival was not the absence of fear, nor the restoration of a life lost. Survival was about claiming existence, however fragile, however constrained. It was about moving through a world that had tried to break her and insisting, silently but resolutely, that she was still here. And as she prepared for the journey to Augusta to meet Thomas, she carried with her the lessons of the road: caution, resilience, and the quiet power of enduring even when the world had been stripped bare.
The road to Augusta stretched before Eleanor like a scar across the southern landscape. Each mile was a reminder of all she had endured since Fort Steedman. Fields, once green and vibrant, lay trampled and burned, their soil scarred from war. Homes were roofless shells, fences collapsed, and rivers lined with the detritus of broken lives. Eleanor moved steadily, with the same determination that had carried her through the forest and the ruined roads, through hunger and uncertainty. She was not the same woman who had fled Fort Steedman months earlier. That Eleanor had been frightened and reactive. This Eleanor was deliberate, quiet, and observant, every sense attuned to survival, but also to reckoning. When she arrived in Augusta, she paused at the familiar streets, the edges of memory brushing against the present. The house on Green Street still stood, though it had suffered. The shutters were broken, the paint peeled, and the front gate hung crooked. Yet it was recognizable, a fragment of a life that had existed before the war's chaos. Eleanor took a deep breath and approached, the envelope in her hand containing the letter she had sent Thomas. Her heart beat unevenly. Every step toward the door was a negotiation with fear, hope, and grief. Thomas was there. When he saw Eleanor at the door, his expression shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible at first. Surprise, recognition, guilt, relief, an entire lifetime of emotion compressed into a single glance. He stepped forward, silent, his hands trembling slightly. Eleanor met him with a cautious steadiness. They embraced, but it was different from the embrace she had shared with Catherine. This one was weighted with history, with shared trauma, with unspoken words and unresolved guilt. Inside the house, the empty rooms echoed with memories. The parlor, once filled with furniture, warmth, and light, was now a hollow space. They sat on the bare floor, facing each other, attempting conversation. Thomas tried to speak first, apologizing for what had happened, for the choices he made during the surrender, for bringing her into a world that had sought to strip her of dignity. His words were careful, measured, but Eleanor knew that apologies alone could not repair the damage done. "I know apologies are not enough," Eleanor said softly.
Her voice trembled, but she held it steady. "You can't undo what happened. You can't restore the years stolen, the fear, the nights we barely survived. Apologies are only words. Survival is what we have." Thomas nodded, accepting the truth of her statement. He had no illusions that he could heal the wounds inflicted by Fort Steedman, the confiscation, the forest, and the long months of uncertainty. He had lived with his own trauma, the humiliation of surrender, the awareness of his wife's suffering, and the inability to protect her. They were both haunted, both changed, yet they had survived. Survival, Eleanor realized, was itself a form of defiance against a world that had sought to erase them. They spoke in fragments at first, cautious, avoiding the most painful memories, circling around what had happened without naming it fully. They spoke of practical matters, the condition of the house, what remained of their possessions, the work Thomas had been doing as a teacher in rural Georgia. Each small exchange was an attempt to rebuild a bridge between two lives that had been shattered. Eleanor observed Thomas carefully, noting the signs of his own trauma, a haunted look in his eyes, pauses where he struggled to find words, gestures of nervous habit. She realized that the war had changed both of them in ways that might never be fully repairable. Over the following weeks, they attempted to reconstruct a semblance of life together. Thomas returned to teaching, though his focus was often interrupted by memories and nightmares. Eleanor tried to establish routines, preparing meals, maintaining the house, and attempting to normalize the rhythm of days. But every act of normalcy was shadowed by the knowledge that the past could not be erased, that the horrors endured were permanent. Even in moments of quiet, Eleanor felt the weight of all that had been lost. The empty rooms of the house became a canvas for their tentative rebuilding. They did not speak of the most horrific experiences at Fort Steedman and Columbia, nor did they recount the forest nights when fear had been their constant companion. Some memories were too painful to speak aloud, others were too raw to be shared. Instead, they focused on small acts, repairing the roof, cleaning the floors, tending a small garden. These acts, mundane in appearance, were radical in their defiance of despair. They reclaimed space and time, asserting control over fragments of a world that had been chaotic and violent. With the efforts, the gap between them remained. Eleanor could not fully reconcile with Thomas. She could not forget the nights of terror, the helplessness, and the systemic abuse she had endured. Thomas struggled with guilt and inadequacy, aware that he had failed to protect her, yet powerless to change the past. They coexisted, sometimes close, sometimes distant, navigating the fragile boundaries of marriage in a landscape where trust and safety had been fractured. Eleanor's understanding of survival deepened during these months. Survival was not only the act of living, but of preserving integrity, of making decisions that maintained a sense of self amid chaos. She realized that she would need to separate from Thomas eventually, not from lack of care, but from the understanding that their shared trauma created a barrier that neither apology nor intention could bridge. Survival required acknowledging limits, recognizing that love and loyalty could coexist with the necessity of self-preservation. One evening, as the sun set behind the ruins of the city, Eleanor walked alone to the edge of the town. The sky burned with colors she had not seen in months. The air, filled with the scent of spring, mingled with the remnants of war. She paused, feeling the weight of everything she had endured. She thought of the women at Fort Steedman, of those who had been lost, of those whose voices were silenced. She thought of the forest nights, the stolen possessions, the corrupt bureaucracy that had treated her as property. Yet she also felt a spark of resilience, a quiet defiance that had carried her through impossible circumstances. The reunion with Thomas was not the resolution she had hoped for. It was not a return to the past, nor a restoration of what had been lost. It was a moment of confrontation, of quiet truths, of understanding that survival and love did not always coincide with healing. Eleanor began to comprehend that her path forward would require strength independent of the past, that her life, though intertwined with Thomas, would need its own definition, separate from the ruins of war and loss. And so, in the empty house on Green Street, Eleanor began to rebuild, not a life of illusion or recovery, but a life of existence, resilience, and cautious hope. The past would remain, the scars indelible, but survival was hers, and with it came a measure of freedom, autonomy, and the possibility of shaping her future, however uncertain it might be. Eleanor understood something crucial. History might erase names, institutions might suppress truths, and injustices might remain unpunished. But her existence, her voice, and her memories could not be taken. She could bear witness, even silently, even in absence, to the realities that others had tried to hide. She could survive with dignity, even if the world refused to recognize it. The days in Augusta passed slowly, each filled with small acts of reclaiming agency, moments of confrontation with the past, and careful navigation of fragile relationships. Eleanor and Thomas existed together in a state of uneasy cohabitation, balancing acknowledgement and avoidance, love and limitation, responsibility and survival. It was neither triumph nor tragedy, but the quiet, enduring complexity of lives irrevocably altered by war. And in this quiet, Eleanor Hale discovered a truth she could carry forward. Surviving was not merely avoiding death. Surviving was insisting on presence, claiming space, asserting selfhood, and preserving the fragments of humanity that conflict and cruelty had attempted to destroy. The spring of 1873 arrived quietly in Charleston. The city was rebuilding in scattered, slow ways after the chaos of war. But for Eleanor Hale, life remained fragile. She had returned to her sister Catherine's home, a space that was both sanctuary and cage. Catherine welcomed her without question, offering warmth, food, and protection, but the world outside remained uncertain. Eleanor's existence was one of careful balance. She had a roof over her head, but no legal recourse, no stable income, and no assurance of autonomy. Eleanor moved through her days with methodical care. She helped Catherine with household chores, cared for her sister's children, and attended church with quiet consistency. Outwardly, she appeared to fit the expected mold of a woman in post-war Charleston, dutiful, reserved, and industrious. But inside, Eleanor's mind was a repository of memories too intense to share fully. She carried the forest mites, the chaos of Fort Steedman, the confiscation and the relentless bureaucratic suppression like invisible chains. The weight of what she had endured was constant, pressing, and unforgiving. Letters to Thomas were infrequent. Each message was careful, balanced between concern and distance, between desire for connection and acknowledgement that some aspects of their past could not be untangled. Responses from him were sparse and formal, reflecting the emotional chasm that had grown between them. Both had survived, both had rebuilt in fragile ways, but the gap between their lives was undeniable. Eleanor understood that survival did not always lead to reconciliation, and that some wounds, however enduring, demanded acknowledgement without expectation of closure. Over the years, Eleanor's presence in Charleston became quieter. She avoided public attention and slowly disappeared from official records. Census enumerators noted her as Thomas Hale's wife, but no one verified the reality of their living situation. City directories and other documents made no mention of her independently. She lived in the interstices of history, present but unrecorded, known but invisible. Eleanor had learned from her experiences that visibility often invited exploitation, scrutiny, and control. To survive fully, she needed to exist beyond the reach of those who sought to define her. Eleanor's days were structured by routine, small comforts, and quiet resistance. She cultivated a small garden, tended to her appearance meticulously, and immersed herself in the rhythms of domestic life. In the evenings, she read by candlelight, often choosing books that offered escape or insight into human resilience. These quiet acts were radical in their own way. Eleanor was asserting agency over her existence in a world that had repeatedly attempted to strip it away. Yet the past never fully receded. Occasionally she would awaken from sleep with a start, hearing phantom sounds of pursuit, or imagining the distant cries of the forest night. She would feel the oppressive presence of officers at Columbia, the systematic cruelty masked as policy, the silence of the tribunal, and the subtle mechanisms of erasure that had sought to remove her and others like her from memory. These intrusions were never constant, but they were persistent, reminders of a truth Eleanor carried alone. Survival was possible, but it was always imperfect, always incomplete. The Civil War had ended officially in 1865, but its effects lingered. Confederate and Union societies alike struggled to restore order, rebuild economies, and reconcile divided populations. For Eleanor, the societal reconstruction offered little personal solace. Legal structures remained biased, social networks fragile, and cultural expectations rigid. Women were expected to maintain propriety, uphold social appearances, and remain silent about experiences that contradicted official narratives. Eleanor understood this, and she accepted it not as acquiescence, but as strategic adaptation. By 1873, Eleanor's presence in Charleston had become almost mythic in its quietude. Friends and family knew her, but only partially. Neighbors might see her in the market or at church, but few understood the magnitude of her experiences. She had become a figure of quiet resilience, an invisible witness to the transformations of a city and a society attempting to move beyond war. And then, one day, she disappeared. Records do not note the date of departure, nor the reason, nor the destination. Census records cease to list her. City directories omit her name. Church documents mention her death, but offer no further context. Eleanor Hale, once a woman forcibly swept into history as property, as detainee, as symbol of bureaucratic cruelty, simply ceased to exist in the documents left behind. The ambiguity of her disappearance is haunting, but in its own way, it is appropriate. Eleanor had spent years navigating a world that had repeatedly attempted to control, define, and erase her. Her final vanishing was a final act of agency. She claimed the power to exit the recorded world on her own terms. Whether she died, moved to another city, or constructed a new identity in secrecy, her disappearance is consistent with a life that had been defined by survival, adaptation, and quiet resistance. Historians decades later would struggle to reconstruct her story. Fragments emerged, testimonies she had given at tribunals, private letters, references in Union officer journals, and occasional mentions in family records. Each piece confirmed the central truths of her experience. Eleanor had been treated as property, held in military detention, subjected to systemic abuse, and forced into silence. Her survival, her testimony, and her ultimate disappearance became emblematic of the experiences of dozens, perhaps hundreds of women whose suffering had been minimized, concealed, or erased. The Fort Steedman confiscations were not isolated. Similar incidents occurred at multiple sites across the collapsing Confederacy in the final months of the war. Reports reveal consistent patterns. Wives of Confederate officers were categorized as property, detained under military authority, and subjected to conditions that violated dignity and autonomy. Investigations were conducted, tribunals convened, and officers were reprimanded privately, but the systemic nature of the abuses was suppressed. Women were offered settlements in exchange for silence, while those who resisted faced prolonged detention or bureaucratic dead ends. The historical record was deliberately sanitized. Yet, Eleanor's existence, her quiet resilience, and her deliberate documentation of events provided a foundation for future historians to uncover truths that had been hidden. Her testimony, released partially in the 21st century, revealed the mechanisms of institutional abuse and the failures of systems that claimed to protect civilians during wartime. It illustrated how legal frameworks and military bureaucracy could rationalize cruelty and erase suffering. Eleanor's story was a lens through which historians could understand not just the war's physical destruction, but its moral and social consequences. Even after her disappearance, Eleanor's impact endured. She embodied the persistence of memory against erasure, the assertion of dignity despite systemic abuse, and the complexity of survival. Her story challenged the neat narratives of wartime heroism, reunion, and reconstruction. It demonstrated that survival often required compromise, strategic silence, and careful navigation of social and institutional power. Her life and vanishing highlighted the countless untold stories of women whose experiences were deliberately excluded from historical accounts. Eleanor Hale's legacy is therefore not in fame or recognition, but in the fact of her survival, the courage to testify, and the quiet insistence on existence in the face of overwhelming adversity. She represents a broader truth, that history is not simply composed of battles and political declarations, but of individual lives shaped, constrained, and sometimes destroyed by systems of power. Her story reminds us that those who survive injustice bear both the weight of memory and the responsibility of witness. As the decades passed, historians gradually pieced together Eleanor's journey. They discovered her tribunal testimony, Sergeant Caleb Ward's journal, letters sent to and from Thomas Hale, and other fragmented documents. These sources confirmed that the treatment she endured was systemic, not accidental, intentional, not incidental. They revealed the structures of authority, legal rationalizations, and social norms that enabled abuse, as well as the mechanisms used to suppress it. Eleanor's experiences became emblematic of a generation of women whose stories had been hidden, reminding future scholars and citizens alike that truth, even if delayed, cannot be entirely erased. Eleanor Hale's story ends ambiguously, but not without significance. She may have died quietly. She may have moved and started anew, or she may have lived under another name, freed from the reach of the institutions that once controlled her. What remains undeniable is that she lived, endured, testified, and resisted erasure. Her survival and the fragments of record she left behind ensure that her experiences and the experiences of women like her are remembered. History is often sanitized, shaped, and incomplete. But Eleanor Hale, in life and in absence, insists on the fullness of reality. Survival does not always mean restoration. Justice does not always follow truth. And memory is a fragile but persistent form of resistance. Her story is a testament to human resilience, the complexity of suffering, and the enduring power of bearing witness, even when the world is unwilling to listen. Eleanor Hale vanished from records after 1873, but her story, painstakingly reconstructed, survives. She is no longer a name lost to history.
Her experiences illuminate the hidden truths of war, the limitations of authority, and the resilience of women who survived impossible circumstances. Her testimony, her silence, and her disappearance are all part of the legacy she left. A life lived under extraordinary duress, a life that insists on recognition even when it cannot receive it.